He called her the asset. Not her name. The asset. Said it the way you would describe a warehouse or a fleet of delivery trucks, or a piece of land waiting to change hands. She had been standing outside the door for 11 seconds when she heard it, still in the shoes she had put on that morning, believing this was going to be the happiest day of her life. By the time she made it out of the building, she was already someone else. Welcome to Visa's Tales. If you are new here, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel, so you never miss a story. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into it. For days earlier, the morning had begun exactly the way a wedding morning was supposed to begin. There had been a team of women in Amara's dressing room since 5, threading beads into her hair, steaming the dress that had taken 3 fittings to get right, filling the room with the bright chatter that surrounds a bride on the morning everyone has been planning for months. Amara had sat through most of it in the particular calm she had trained herself into over the past year, the calm of someone who has decided deliberately not to examine a decision too closely, because examining it too closely tends to reveal things you would rather not carry down an aisle. She had gone looking for her uncle at a little after 9, holding a folder of documents his assistant had asked her to bring him for a final signature before the ceremony. Some administrative matter connected to the transition of her shares, nothing she had been told to expect any difficulty with. The door to his study had been left slightly open. She had not meant to listen. She had simply arrived at the moment 2 voices inside were already mid-conversation, and something in the tone of it, clipped, businesslike, entirely wrong for a wedding morning, had stopped her hand before it reached the door. Once the ceremony is done, Connell's voice had said, clipped and certain, we move the share transfer inside the 90-day window. Sooner if the board will approve it. I do not want this sitting exposed longer than necessary. Her uncle's voice, agreeing, murmured something about the transition committee, about keeping things smooth, about not wanting complications. And she has agreed to the operational restructuring? Correct. No surprises after the fact. She understands her role. She has always been reasonable about the important things. Good. Keep the asset compliant and this closes cleanly. Amara had stood in the corridor holding the folder for what felt like a very long time and was, in fact, only a few seconds, before she understood that the sentence was not going to resolve into something less than what it sounded like. Nobody inside that room corrected the word. Nobody paused. It had simply continued, matter of fact, 2 men discussing a transaction that happened, coincidentally, to involve her wedding. She had set the folder down on a side table in the corridor, very quietly, and walked away in the opposite direction from the study, still in her half-finished hair and her dressing gown, and had kept walking until walking became something closer to running, out through a side entrance the catering staff used, past a delivery van whose driver did not look up, into a morning that had absolutely no idea what to do with a runaway bride. She had not planned anything beyond that first door. She understood this now, for days later, with a clarity that had cost her a great deal to arrive at. 4 days is a long time when you have nothing. Amara had learned this slowly, in the particular way you learn things when you are not prepared to learn them. Not as information but as a series of small physical facts that accumulated until they became a kind of knowledge she had never needed before. Hunger did not arrive all at once. It came in waves, each one slightly worse than the last, interrupted by moments when it seemed to disappear entirely and then return sharper than before. A body could go a surprisingly long time without proper sleep before the exhaustion stopped being tiredness and became something closer to a low, constant static behind the eyes. Shame, she had discovered, was load-bearing. You could carry an enormous amount of it if you had no other choice. The first night she had slept, or tried to sleep, in the covered entrance of a closed pharmacy, still in the wedding dress, until a security guard doing his rounds had woken her at 3 in the morning and told her, not unkindly, that she could not stay there. She had walked until dawn after that, through parts of the city she had only ever seen from the inside of a car, learning things about distance and exhaustion that nobody in her previous life had ever required her to learn. The second night she had traded the dress, the actual wedding dress, beaded bodice and all, to a woman running a second-hand clothing stall who had asked no questions and given her, in exchange, a faded wrapper, a plain blouse, and a small amount of money that had bought 2 meals and evaporated by the following afternoon. She had told herself, folding the dress into the woman's hands, that this was practical rather than symbolic. It had not felt practical. It had felt like taking off a version of herself she was not sure she would ever be able to put back on, even if she wanted to. By the third day she had understood, with the specific clarity of someone whose old assumptions were being dismantled one at a time, that the city she had grown up in treated a woman with nothing very differently from how it had treated her with everything. She had been moved along by 3 different shopkeepers. She had been offered, twice, kindnesses that turned out to have conditions attached that she had extracted herself from as quickly and as carefully as she could manage. She had learned which doorways stayed dry, which corners felt safe enough to sit in after dark, and which strangers' eyes to avoid meeting altogether. She was sitting on the low step outside a shuttered provision store on a street she did not recognize, on the 4th evening, in the same faded wrapper and plain blouse she had been wearing for 2 days now. She had been thinking, for most of that afternoon, about going back. Not because anything had changed about what she had heard. She could still hear it exactly as clearly as she had heard it 4 days ago, standing outside the door of her uncle's study on what was supposed to be her wedding morning, listening to 2 men discuss her future in the flat vocabulary of a business acquisition. She was thinking about going back because she was hungry and tired and frightened in a way she had not known it was possible to be frightened, and because 4 days of freedom that felt like this were beginning to seem like a poor trade for a marriage she at least understood the shape of. She was still thinking about it when a man stopped in front of her. He was tall, dressed simply. A plain shirt, sleeves pushed up, the look of someone who had left an office some hours ago and had not bothered to change before running an errand. He was carrying a small bag from the shop 2 doors down, which was still open, unlike the one she was sitting outside of. He looked at her for a moment. Not the look she had grown used to over 4 days, the quick assessment and dismissal that most people gave a woman sitting on a step at dusk. He looked at her the way you look at someone you are actually seeing. "Have you eaten today?" She looked up at him. She had not been asked a direct question by a stranger in 4 days that was not some version of "get away from here." No. It was the truth, and she did not have the energy left to construct anything else. He did not say anything else immediately. He turned and walked back toward the shop he had just come from, and she thought, with the flat disappointment of someone who has stopped expecting anything, that he was simply leaving. He came back 4 minutes later with a second bag. He set it down beside her without ceremony. Bread, a carton of juice, 2 oranges, a small tin of something that required no cooking. He did not make a show of it. He did not linger to watch her react, which she was grateful for, because she was not certain she could have managed her face if he had. "Thank you." He nodded. He looked at the sky, which had gone the particular gray that meant rain within the hour, and then looked back at her, and something in his expression shifted into a kind of decision being made. "Where are you sleeping tonight?" She did not answer immediately. He seemed to understand the silence correctly. "I am not asking to be intrusive. I am asking because it is about to rain and this street is not somewhere I would want to be caught in it after dark. I will manage." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his own face had changed slightly, though she would not understand why until much later when he told her about his mother, about the 8 months when he was 11 years old when his father's business had failed and the family had gone, briefly and terrifyingly, from comfortable to nothing, and a neighbor had fed them for 3 weeks without ever once making his mother feel like a charity case. He had never forgotten the specific dignity of that neighbor's kindness, the way she had framed every meal as though she simply happened to have cooked too much, and he had promised himself, somewhere in that hard stretch of his childhood, that if he ever had anything to give, he would try to give it the same way. "I have a guest room. It is empty most of the time. You would have a door that locks from the inside, and nobody would ask you anything you did not want to answer." He paused. "I am telling you this because it is true, not because I expect you to accept it." She looked at him. She had spent 4 days developing a very specific and very tired instinct for reading whether a stranger's kindness had a cost attached, and she found, examining this man's offer from every angle she had energy left to examine it from, that she could not locate the cost. That frightened her almost as much as the alternative. "What is your name?" "Daniel." She gave him only her first name. "Amara." She did not offer anything else, and he did not ask for anything else, which she noticed and filed away as one more piece of evidence in a case she was not yet ready to fully believe. It began to rain as they walked. Daniel's house was modest from the outside, a simple gate, a small garden that had clearly been planted by someone who enjoyed gardening rather than someone paid to maintain an image, a single-story building that gave no particular indication of what its owner did for a living. Amara noticed this without being able to say exactly why she noticed it. She had grown up in houses that announced themselves. This one did not. A woman met them at the door, 60 or so, wrapped against the evening cool, her expression shifting from surprise to something warmer and more practical the moment she took in Amara's condition. "This is Amara," he said, turning to the older woman. "She will be staying in the guest room tonight. Mrs. Ease runs this house better than I do. If you need anything, she is the one to ask, not me." Mrs. Ease did not ask any questions. She simply took Amara by the arm with the gentle firmness of someone who had decided, in the space of 4 seconds, that this young woman needed feeding and rest before she needed anything else, including an explanation. Amara ate that night at the kitchen table, in dry clothes that Mrs. Ease had produced from somewhere without comment, and slept for 11 hours in a bed that felt, after 4 nights on pavement and 1 uncomfortable bus station bench, like the most extraordinary luxury she had ever experienced, including several actual luxuries she had grown up taking for granted. The first 2 days had passed in the particular slow recovery of a body that had been pushed too far. Long stretches of sleep, meals Mrs. Ease brought without being asked, a bath Amara took on the first evening that lasted nearly an hour, until the water ran cold and she still had not fully convinced herself she was safe. By the second evening, she had begun, cautiously, to help. Clearing the table after dinner without being asked. Folding a stack of laundry Mrs. Ease had left on a chair. Small, ordinary tasks that gave her hands something to do while her mind worked through the enormity of what she had done. Mrs. Ease had noticed, and said nothing beyond a quiet "you did not have to do that," offered without any real conviction that Amara should stop. Daniel had come home each evening from an office she knew nothing about yet, tired in the specific way of someone who worked hard at something he had built himself, and had asked, both nights, the same simple question, "How are you settling in?" and had accepted, both nights, her careful, incomplete answers without pushing for more. It was on the third morning, walking with Daniel to a small shop near his office where he sometimes stopped for coffee before work, that she heard her name. Not from him. From a radio behind the shop counter, tuned to a morning news program. The announcer's voice moving through the headlines with the particular rapid cadence of someone reading a list. Authorities continue the search for Amara Kaidozi, sole heir to the Kaidozi Group, missing since her wedding day 4 days ago. Family sources say she did not hear the rest of it. She had already turned, sharply, toward the shop window, her back to the radio, her body reacting before her mind had fully processed what it needed to react to. Daniel glanced at her. He did not say anything about it, but she saw him notice the sharpness of the turn, the sudden stiffness in her shoulders, and she understood that whatever explanation she had been quietly assembling over the past 2 days had just acquired a deadline. She did not know yet how much time that deadline actually gave her. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that Amara had not expected and did not entirely trust, because trusting it felt like a kind of danger she was not ready to name. She had a room. She had food that appeared without her needing to ask for it or explain herself in exchange for it. And within the first week, she had something that resembled purpose. Daniel had noticed, as early as the 4th or 5th day, that she moved through his study with an unconscious competence that did not match the story she had told him in vague outline, a story about difficult circumstances and a family she could not go back to. By the second week, that noticing had turned into an actual job. "You know how to organize a filing system," he said one afternoon, watching her sort through a drawer of invoices he had been meaning to deal with for 3 months. "Everyone knows how to organize a filing system." She did not look up. Not everyone organizes it by date received, then cross-references by vendor, and flags anything past 60 days for follow-up. That is not a skill people who have spent their lives without an office develop by accident. She had looked up at him then, and for a moment she had thought he was going to ask the question directly, and she had prepared, in that moment, several versions of an answer, none of which were the truth. He had not asked. He had simply offered. "If you want something to do while you are here, this office could use the help. I will pay you properly for it. Not charity. Actual work." She had accepted because it was the first thing anyone had offered her in weeks that let her be useful rather than merely grateful, and because the alternative, sitting in the guest room with nothing to occupy the anxious static that lived behind her eyes now, had become its own kind of unbearable. Evenings, over the 2 weeks that followed, developed their own quiet shape. Daniel was not a man who filled silence for its own sake, which Amara found, after a lifetime spent around people who talked constantly to manage their own discomfort, to be one of the more restful things about him. They ate dinner most nights at the same small table, Mrs. E's often joining them rather than serving and retreating, and the conversation moved, gradually, from careful and general to something closer to real. He told her, one evening, about starting his company with almost nothing. A single delivery contract, a borrowed motorcycle, for years of reinvesting every profit back into the business instead of into himself. He told her about the specific terror of the second year, when a larger competitor had tried to undercut him out of the market entirely, and how he had survived it by refusing to compromise on the one thing he could control, which was treating every driver and every client exactly the same regardless of how much money moved through the relationship. She told him, in careful edited pieces, about a father she had adored and a business she had been raised to inherit without ever being taught how to actually run it. The loneliness of being groomed for a role nobody had bothered to explain to her in any detail beyond its obligations. She did not tell him whose company, or how large, or what her father's name had actually been. She told him enough to be honest without telling him enough to be recognized. And she was aware, even as she did it, of the quiet dishonesty of that careful edit, even though every word inside it was true. I keep thinking, one evening, that you have not asked me a single question I did not want to answer. I decided early on that you would tell me what you wanted me to know. I did not think it was my business to pull the rest out of you before you were ready. That is a very patient way to live. It is the only way I know how to be. I watched enough people get pushed into corners as a child to decide I never wanted to be the one doing the pushing. She had looked at him for a long moment after that, and something in her chest had moved in a way she did not yet have the vocabulary to name, though she would understand it much later as the earliest recognizable shape of falling in love with someone. Chioma, who ran Daniel's office with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been doing it for 6 years and trusted almost nobody's competence but her own, had noticed things about Amara within the first couple of weeks that Daniel, generously inclined and slightly too trusting for his own good, had not. She holds a fork like someone who was taught which one to use first, Chioma said, one evening after Amara had gone up to the guest room. And she corrected me very politely on a shareholder agreement clause last week. Who corrects a lawyer on shareholder agreement language by accident? Daniel had considered this. Maybe she worked in an office before he offered, before whatever happened to her. Maybe, Chioma said, in the tone of someone who did not believe it but had decided not to push the point that evening. It was 2 weeks and 1 day after Amara arrived that Daniel saw the newspaper. He read 3 papers most mornings, a habit from early in his career when information had been the only advantage he had over competitors with more capital, and he was moving through the business section with his coffee when he turned a page and found himself looking at a face he now knew extremely well, arranged in a formal photograph beneath a headline that took him several seconds to fully process because his mind kept insisting there had to be another explanation. Missing heiress. Family increases reward. Renews public appeal. The photograph beneath it was Amara. Younger, perhaps by 2 or 3 years, dressed for what looked like a company event, but unmistakably her. The same eyes, the same specific set of the jaw when she was trying not to show what she was thinking. He sat very still for a long moment. He could hear her in the next room, sorting through a stack of correspondence, humming something under her breath the way she did when she thought no one was listening. He read the article twice. Kaidozi Group, one of the largest conglomerates in the country. A father who had built it from almost nothing and died 4 years ago, leaving his only child as sole heir under a board structure that gave her uncle, Chief Obiora, day-to-day operational control until she formally assumed her position. A position that, according to the article, she was scheduled to assume immediately following her wedding, which had been interrupted, according to family sources, by circumstances that remained unclear. He looked up. She was standing in the doorway of his study, a folder in her hand, about to ask him something ordinary, and she stopped when she saw his face. He did not say anything immediately. Daniel, what is wrong? He looked at the newspaper on his desk, then back at her. He did not know in that moment what he was more unsettled by, the fact that she was apparently one of the wealthiest women in the country, or the fact that she had been living in his guest room for 2 weeks organizing his invoices and had never once mentioned it. He said nothing about it that day. He was not certain what to say, and he had learned, over the years of building a company from almost nothing, that the things you say before you have thought them through are usually the things you regret most. He watched her instead, carefully, and with a kind of unease he did not fully understand, over the following days. She had not asked him for anything. That was the detail he kept returning to. If she had run from a wedding into a life of extraordinary wealth, she was simply keeping quiet about for her own reasons. She had had 2 weeks in which she could have asked him for money, or a car, or an introduction to anyone at all who could help her return to whatever life she was avoiding. She had asked him for none of it. She had asked once for a second pen because the first one had run out. Chioma, when he finally told her what he had seen in the newspaper, did not look surprised. "I told you the fork thing meant something." He sat back in his chair. "What do I do with this?" Chioma considered the question seriously, which he appreciated, because she did not always take his questions seriously when she thought the answer was obvious. "There is a reward number in that article. You could call it. Tell them where she is. Let her family handle whatever this is." He looked at her. "Or you could ask her yourself. Give her the chance to tell you before you decide anything." He thought about this for 2 more days before he acted on it, which was longer than he usually took to make a decision about anything, and which told him, more clearly than he wanted to admit, how much this particular decision actually weighed. He caught himself, during those 2 days, running through possibilities that unsettled him more than he expected. Perhaps she had been running from the wedding not out of principle but out of some scheme he could not yet see the shape of. Perhaps the version of her sitting in his study each evening, quiet and grateful and increasingly familiar, was a performance calibrated for exactly this kind of situation. He turned these thoughts over carefully, the way he turned over any risk before committing to it in business, and found each time that they did not survive contact with what he actually knew of her. The way she had refused for 2 weeks to ask him for anything beyond a second pen. The way she had cried, quietly and without noticing he had seen it, over a cheap radio ballad on Mrs. Ease's kitchen radio one evening, for reasons she never explained. He was not a man who trusted his own instincts uncritically, but he trusted them enough after 2 days to stop treating the newspaper article as evidence of anything except a fact she had not yet found the right moment to share. It was Mrs. Ease, in the end, who came closest to hearing the truth before Daniel did. Not because Amara planned it that way, but because grief and exhaustion have a way of finding the gentlest available ear. She had been helping Mrs. Ease prepare dinner on the Thursday evening, chopping vegetables at the kitchen counter with a competence that had, weeks earlier, made Mrs. Ease raise an eyebrow and say nothing, when Amara had stopped mid-motion, knife still in hand, and said without any lead-up at all, "Do you ever do something you cannot undo and then discover you are not certain you would undo it even if you could?" Mrs. Ease had not looked up from her own work. "Depends what it cost you. Everything. Or it feels like everything. Sometimes I think it was the bravest thing I have ever done. Sometimes I think I destroyed my life over a conversation I was not even supposed to hear." Mrs. Ease had set down her own knife. What conversation? Her voice had gone gentle. Amara had looked at her for a long moment, and the truth had risen in her throat, close enough to taste, close enough that she had opened her mouth to say it. Then she had thought about Daniel finding out from her directly rather than secondhand through his housekeeper, and something in her had pulled back. "It does not matter," she said instead. "I am sorry. I should not have said anything." Mrs. Ease had looked at her for a long moment, the particular look of an older woman who has seen enough of the world to recognize when someone is standing at the edge of a confession and stepping back from it. "Whenever you are ready. This house is not in a hurry." Daniel found Amara in the study 2 evenings later, the newspaper folded under his arm, the decision finally made after 2 days of turning it over. She was at the desk, going through the same drawer of invoices she had started with weeks earlier, now nearly finished, the whole system reorganized into something considerably more useful than what he had been managing on his own. He set the newspaper down on the desk in front of her, opened to the page with her photograph. She looked at it. She went very still, in the specific way people go still when the thing they have been dreading arrives exactly as they imagined it would. "Is this you?" He did not say it with accusation. She would think about that, afterward, for a long time, that his voice had carried no anger in it at all, only a kind of careful, direct gentleness. The voice of a man asking a question he genuinely wanted the true answer to rather than a question designed to catch her in something. "Yes." He waited. She told him. She told him about her father, who had built Kaidozi Group from a single trading company into one of the largest conglomerates in the country, and who had died 4 years ago, leaving her the sole heir to something she had never fully wanted the way he had wanted it for her. She told him about her uncle, Chief Obiora, who had run the company's daily operations since her father's death and who genuinely believed, she thought, that he knew better than she did what the company and the family required. She told him about Kunnel, the man she had been scheduled to marry, a match arranged for reasons that had everything to do with consolidating business relationships and nothing to do with anything she had ever felt for him. A match she had agreed to because she had been raised her entire life to believe that her preferences were a secondary consideration to the family's stability. And she told him about the morning of the wedding, standing outside her uncle's study door in her wedding dress, waiting to be called in for a final signature on some document nobody had explained to her, and hearing, through the door that had been left slightly open, Kunnel's voice discussing the marriage with her uncle in language she had not been meant to hear. He called me the asset. Not my name. The asset. He was talking about share transfer timing and how to keep the asset compliant during the transition period, and my uncle was agreeing with him, and I stood outside that door and understood all at once that neither of them had ever once, in the entire process of arranging my wedding, thought of me as a person they were marrying me to. I was a transaction they were completing. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. So you left. I left. I did not plan it. I did not think about money or a phone or where I would sleep. I simply walked and then I ran, and by the time I stopped running I was somewhere I did not recognize with nothing but the dress on my back, and I understood slowly over the following hours exactly how unprepared I was for what I had just done. He looked at her. Why didn't you tell me? Any point in the last 2 weeks? She thought about the honest answer for a moment before she gave it to him. Because you were the first person in 4 days who was not looking at me to figure out what I was worth. You gave me food and a room and a reason to get out of bed in the morning before you knew anything about who my father was. I did not want that to change. I did not want to become the asset again, even to you. He was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. I would not have treated you differently. I know that now. I did not know it 3 weeks ago. I had never met anyone who wouldn't. He looked at her steadily. I still don't want anything from your company. I want you to hear me say that plainly, because I understand how this looks. I didn't know there was a company when I bought you a loaf of bread. I don't want a position in it now that I know there is. I know. I have known that since the fork conversation with Chioma that you thought I did not hear. He almost smiled, despite everything. Then a car pulled into the driveway outside, headlights sweeping briefly across the study window, and both of them went still at the same moment, and Amara's face changed in a way that told Daniel, before either of them said anything else, exactly who had just arrived. Chief Obiora came through the front door with the controlled urgency of a man who has spent 2.5 weeks managing a crisis and has finally, exhaustingly, arrived at its resolution. He was in his 60s, dressed as though he had come directly from a board meeting rather than a search, and his relief at seeing Amara standing in the study doorway was immediate and, Daniel would later admit, genuinely visible. Whatever else was true about the man, he had clearly been frightened. Amara. Thank God. Amara did not move toward him. How did you find me? CCTV footage from a shop 2 streets from here, 3 days ago. It took our security team this long to trace it properly. He looked at Daniel, taking him in for the first time, his expression shifting into something more guarded. And you are? Daniel Osei. This is my house. Chief Obiora's eyes moved between them, calculating something, and Amara watched him do it with a clarity she had not had 3 weeks earlier. Watched him assess Daniel the way he assessed everything, for what it might mean for the company's position. We need to talk about what happens next, he said, turning back to Amara. The board has been managing significant concern about your absence. The stock has been volatile. We need a statement at minimum, and we need to discuss how to handle the situation with Kunnel's family, who have been, understandably, upset by... I heard you. Chief Obiora stopped. The morning of the wedding. Outside your study door. I heard you and Kunnel discussing me. He called me the asset. You did not correct him. You discussed the timeline for my share transfer as though I were a shipment you were arranging delivery for. Chief Obiora's face did something complicated. Surprise. Quickly followed by an attempt to recover his composure. Amara, that was business language. It did not mean. It meant exactly what it sounded like it meant. Her voice was steady in a way that surprised even her. I am not marrying Cunnel. I am not going to spend the rest of my life being managed by two men who have never once asked me what I actually wanted, because you have both spent so long deciding what I should want that it apparently never occurred to either of you to ask. Chief Obiora looked at her for a long moment. Something in his posture shifted, not quite defeat, but something adjacent to it, an old man recognizing, perhaps for the first time, that the niece in front of him was not the compliant asset he had been managing for 4 years. The company needs stability, he said, his voice quieter now. Your father built something extraordinary. I have only ever tried to protect it. You protected it by planning to hand me to a man who saw me as a line item. That is not protection. That is just a different kind of loss. Daniel, who had been standing quietly beside her through all of this, did not speak until Chief Obiora's eyes moved to him again, clearly searching for the angle, the thing Daniel wanted out of all this. I want to be clear about something. I run a logistics company. It is doing well. I do not need anything from Kaidozi Group, and I do not want anything from it. I did not know Amara's name 3 weeks ago, let alone her net worth. If she decides tomorrow that she never wants to see me again, that will not change how I feel about the 3 weeks I did know her. He looked at Chief Obiora directly. I am telling you this because I suspect it is the question you actually came here to answer, even if you were too polite to ask it outright. Chief Obiora studied him for a long moment. Something in his expression, slowly, began to shift. Amara stepped slightly closer to her uncle. I am not disappearing from the company. I am the sole heir. I intend to take up my position on my own timeline, doing the job the way I believe it should be done. But I am doing it as myself, not as an asset being managed toward a merger I never agreed to want. If you can work with that, I would like to find a way forward with you. If you cannot, I will find people who can. Chief Obiora was quiet for a long time. I did not know you felt so strongly, he said eventually. I thought I was doing right by your father's memory. You were doing what was easiest to explain to a board. She said it not unkindly. That is not the same thing. He nodded slowly, something in him visibly deflating, an old certainty giving way to something more uncertain and, perhaps, more honest. I will need time to think about how we move forward. Take it. I have taken 3 weeks for myself. You can take some too. Chief Obiora left an hour later, considerably less certain than he had arrived, and considerably more thoughtful. Daniel and Amara stood in the study for a long moment after the sound of the car had faded down the street, neither of them speaking, the weight of the previous hour settling slowly into something they could both finally breathe around. That was not how I expected that to go, she said eventually. How did you expect it to go? Shouting, ultimatums, him trying to physically remove me from your house. I had built an entire version of this evening in my head over the last 3 weeks, and none of it looked like that. Daniel considered this. People do not always match the shape you have built for them in your head. Sometimes that is worse. He looked at her. Sometimes, apparently, it is better. She sat down slowly in the chair behind the desk, her chair, in a sense, for the past 3 weeks, though it had never occurred to her until this exact moment how strange that ownership was, given everything else that was true about her. I need to go back. Not tonight, but soon. There is a company that does not run itself, and a great many people whose jobs depend on decisions I have spent my entire adult life being protected from having to make. I know. I do not know what that means for this, gesturing vaguely between them, for whatever this has become. Daniel was quiet for a moment. I did not fall for you because you had nothing. I am not going to stop because it turns out you have a great deal. He looked at her steadily. Whatever you need to go and do, I will still be exactly here when the days allow for it. That is not a complicated offer. It is just a true one. She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her chest loosened in a way it had not loosened since the morning she had stood outside her uncle's study door and heard herself described as an asset. Cunnel called her directly, once, 3 days after Chief Obiora's visit. Amara had almost not answered. She recognized the number, felt the old familiar tightening in her chest, and then decided, deliberately, that she had spent enough of the last month being frightened of things and answered anyway. I heard you are alive, he said, by way of greeting. His tone carried no particular warmth, and no particular apology either. The tone of a man managing an inconvenience rather than mourning a loss. There was a brief silence. I want you to know this was never personal, he said eventually. The arrangement made sense. It still makes sense, if you wanted to reconsider before the story does any more damage to either of our families. Amara found, listening to him, that she was not angry. She had expected, if this call ever came, to feel something sharper. Instead, she felt something closer to the specific calm of watching a door that had once seemed enormous turn out, on closer inspection, to be quite small. I heard what you said about me. Outside my uncle's study. You called me the asset, Cunnel. Not once, in the entire conversation, did you call me by my name. Another silence, this one longer. That is business language, echoing, almost word for word, the same defense her uncle had offered. It does not mean what you are choosing to hear in it. It means exactly what it sounds like. I am not angry with you anymore. I want you to understand that because I think it will save us both time. I am not angry because I do not think you are capable of seeing me any other way, and being angry at a man for being exactly what he has always shown himself to be feels like wasted effort. I hope the next arrangement makes sense for you too. I will not be part of it. She ended the call before he could answer, and sat for a moment in the quiet that followed, surprised by how little it had cost her to say. Cunnel, she learned 2 days later through a brief and entirely businesslike message from a company lawyer, had already begun exploring a different, more explicitly commercial arrangement with a different family entirely, having concluded, apparently within hours of the story breaking publicly, that the Kaidozi merger was no longer worth the reputational complexity. Amara found she felt almost nothing about this except a distant, clarifying relief. The confirmation, one final time, of exactly what she had always been to him, and the quiet satisfaction of having said so to his face before he had the chance to disappear from her life without ever hearing it. The weeks that followed were not simple. Amara moved back, eventually, into her family's compound, though not into her old role exactly. She spent the first month largely in meetings, learning the actual shape of a company she had been raised to inherit but never taught to run, insisting on decisions being explained to her rather than simply executed on her behalf, rebuilding, piece by piece, a relationship with her uncle that was more honest than the one that had existed before, if not yet entirely comfortable. She surprised the board, in her first formal meeting, by asking to see the invoice management systems across 3 divisions before discussing anything else on the agenda. A request that confused several of the older directors and delighted precisely one member of staff in the finance department, who mentioned afterward to a colleague that the new heiress apparently knew more about accounts receivable than anyone had expected. Amara, hearing this secondhand, had laughed for the first time in weeks, thinking of a drawer of invoices in a modest study across town, and the man who had trusted her to organize it before he knew her name was worth anything at all. Chioma, for her part, had taken considerable and largely unapologetic credit for having noticed first. I told him about the fork. She reminded Daniel more than once in the months that followed, whenever the story of how it had all unraveled came up among people who knew both halves of it. Nobody ever believes the assistant. She kept the guest room at Daniel's house, in a manner of speaking. She was there most weekends and some weeknights, and Mrs. Ease had stopped treating her arrival as anything other than routine within the first month, which Amara found, privately, to be one of the more moving developments of the entire strange season of her life. Daniel did not change. This was, Amara came to understand, the single most remarkable thing about him, more remarkable even than the initial kindness that had started everything. He did not adjust his house or his habits, or the modest, unhurried way he moved through his own days, now that the woman staying in his guest room was, by any conventional measure, significantly wealthier than he was. He continued reading 3 newspapers most mornings. He still stopped some mornings at the small shop near his office for coffee, the same shop where a radio had once announced her name while she stood with her back to the counter, frozen. But on the weekends, when there was no office to walk to, he still made a point every so often of walking a longer route that took them past the shuttered provision store instead. It was down that street on an ordinary Saturday morning some months later that they walked together, the way they had walked countless times since that first rainy evening. The shopkeeper next door, an older man named Mr. Adebayo who had grown used to seeing them both pass over the months, greeted them warmly. Amara stopped at the small step outside the provision store where she had once sat, for days into having nothing, deciding whether to go back to a life that would have swallowed her whole. She looked at Daniel. You asked me once if I had eaten. I remember. I have thought about that question more than almost anything anyone has ever asked me. Nobody had asked me anything that simple in years. Everyone around me was always asking what I was worth, or what I could offer, or what marrying me would secure. You asked if I had eaten. He looked at her. It seemed like the important question. It was. She reached into her bag and handed Mr. Adebayo a folded envelope. A modest, quiet contribution to a small community fund she had started for people sleeping rough in the neighborhood, arranged without press attention, without her name attached to it publicly, exactly the way Daniel had always done things. Mr. Adebayo thanked her. He did not know, and did not need to know, that she had once sat on the step outside his neighbor's shuttered shop with nothing at all. Daniel watched her do this with an expression she had come to recognize over the months. Quiet, unhurried approval, the specific look of a man who had never once needed her to prove anything to him, and who was, nonetheless, glad to watch her choose to. They turned to walk home. I never asked you what you were worth, he said. I want you to know I still don't think about it that way. I know. That is why I stayed, she added after a moment. Not because you were kind to me once. Because you never once needed to know who I was in order to decide that I mattered. He took her hand as they walked, the same unhurried way he did everything, and the street around them went on with its ordinary Saturday business, entirely unaware that it had, some months earlier, quietly changed the course of the richest young woman in the country's entire life, simply because one man had stopped and looked and asked a very small question.